So, how wonderful that we're all here together tonight. So first of all, Thupten Jinpa, I want to welcome you. It's such a delight, and it's such a wonderful surprise when this event manifested tonight, and I'm really grateful that you leading this talk. I also want to welcome you all. When Geshe Thupten Jinpa offered to lead this talk tonight, it was a real thrill because I knew that tonight was going to be a family event and that we'd be able to come together with the friends of Jamyang and the Tibetan community and the Mongolian community and all our friends and family. And the atmosphere preparing for tonight has been phenomenal, and I can feel it in the room, and I'm really, really happy to see you all. And many of you are meeting for the first time because I myself have just arrived. So my name is Fabienne, and I am the new center director here at Jamyang. And I've been here for about a month, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you. I told Thupten Jinpa yesterday how thrilled I was that tonight was happening for many reasons. So before coming here, I was living in California, and I was living close to San Francisco. And I saw that our sister center in San Francisco was hosting an evening with Thupten Jinpa where he was going to talk about Lama Tsongkhapa, and in honor of the 600th anniversary of the passing of Lama Tsongkhapa, and a biography that's upcoming, which I'll talk about. And I remember at the time thinking, as I was going to be away in retreat, and I remember thinking, oh, I so wish I could be there. And then somehow, Thupten Jinpa is coming here and giving the talk. Completely phenomenal. He's coming to us. So you all know Thupten Jinpa and the many hats that he's wearing and the work that he's doing, translating precious Tibetan texts so that we can have access to this profound scholarship, and doing work in Tibetan, preserving the text as well, which is actually, he was telling me, the bulk of his time is spent doing that. And that's work that I think many of us may not be even aware of. And then, of course, the work that he's doing in the secular world, having worked with Stanford, developing the program of cultivating compassion training. I never know if it's cultivating compassion, CCT. And so tomorrow we have a day-long introducing that program. And I myself did the program there at Stanford a number of years ago, and it was incredibly helpful, and it's spreading, it's spread in the US, and it'll start spreading in Europe and beyond, and helping many different communities in the police, healthcare, education, and so forth. And so I told Thupten Jinpa he's one of those people where you kind of wonder how it is that there's only one of him, because the work that he's doing sounds like there's 10 of him. Anyway, so it's a real honor to have you tonight. Thank you. And of course, I forgot to say, but Thupten Jinpa has written a biography of Lama Tsongkhapa, a great thinker, Tibetan philosopher and yogi, who kind of distilled the teachings of the great Indian Nalanda tradition, and thematically organized, and so that a number of us are direct beneficiaries of the work of Lama Tsongkhapa. And there's no real biography currently available to Western readership, really. And so when we heard that that biography was coming out, we were so excited. And so many of us have probably already pre-ordered it, but it's coming out in November. And so tonight's talk, will be about that. And thank you for taking that task on, really, truly. And so we, just so you know, we'll offer a short mandala, and then Tsongkhapa will start. Thank you.
No. Good evening. I think I'm going to sit cross-legged actually. First of all, I would like to thank Jamyang and particularly Venerable Fabien for hosting me this evening. In fact, I teased her because normally when I come through London, I used to stay at friends' place, but this time both of my friends' couches were not available. One of whom is here, Valerie. So finally I got in touch with Jamyang and said, can I stay at the center? So this evening talk is my rent. Well, humor aside, I really wanted to do this, partly because Jamyang is a center that I have personally a lot of affection for. And I've seen this particular center from its birth. And when this building was bought, Geshe who's my colleague from Serame University, Serame College, who is now the abbot of Serame College, he was actively involved, not just as the resident teacher, but in fact working physically in painting and knocking things down. So I've seen this center really grow from this courthouse, probably police locker room, to this beautiful place, and the energy is completely shifted. And this time, as I walked in, I could also feel the energy of the warmth in this place. I was a little worried that without Geshe-la, what it might feel like. I don't think I've ever given a talk in this particular center, but the previous incarnation, the one in Finsbury Park, I've given several talks there when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, so I used to come down. So it's a real joy to be able to have this evening with you And, there are many familiar faces, but majority are unfamiliar faces, which I always take it as a good news. Because if I end up speaking only to people that I know, clearly something is wrong. So, and I chose to speak about Je Rinpoche for several reasons, one of which is my own life has pretty much ended up focusing a lot on Tsongkhapa. I did my PhD on Tsongkhapa's philosophy at Cambridge. I studied a lot of Tsongkhapa's text as part of my monastic training in Ganden. And also, over time, although I read quite widely of Tibetan masters' writings, but I keep coming back to Tsongkhapa. There is something about these authors, these masters' teachings and writings that seems to speak to me powerfully. And I've just finished finally editing a major philosophical work, which one of his last philosophical writings, which was completed the year before he passed away. It's a major work on Madhyamaka philosophy of emptiness. I've translated the work, in fact, 6-7 years ago, but never really got around to editing it. I can be a bit of a perfectionist, so I don't believe in putting things out there that I don't feel confident or at least proud at the time. Of course, later, many years later, you can think, oh, I could have done this better this way, that one. But at least I try to make sure that when I bring it out, I can feel pride. I can feel satisfied that I've done my best. So I always make sure that whatever text that I translate, I really do the editing myself quite carefully. So, which meant I needed about a block of 3 to 4 months full concentration in a way that I forget the entire world. And I haven't been able to find that block. Fortunately, this spring I found that. And I was able to just zoom in and finish the editing. So hopefully it will come out next spring. I was hoping that it would come out this year because it's the 600th anniversary, but just the production process is too complicated. So at least it will have the publication year 2019, so that a couple of years later, people will know it was connected with the 600th anniversary. So I feel really privileged to be able to, in some way, serve this great master, be his medium in English language. For the Tibetans, of course, you don't need a medium for him. His writings are all available. But for the outside world, English is the primary language. There are many important languages in the world, but the fact is, English is, actually there is a particular term for it. It's actually sometimes referred to as the host language. So many secondary language literature tends to be translated from English. So English, and then also many people who are not native speakers, if they want to write for an international audience, they tend to write in English. So English somehow happened to be that language. Probably it's partly the British colonial legacy. They were able to spread their guns and the English language quite far across the world for whatever may be the reason. And it's partly the language itself is very versatile. I speak a little bit of German and a little bit of French. I speak Hindi and of course, Tibetan is my native tongue. When I compare the languages across, I keep admiring the versatility of English. It's a very straightforward kind of, practical language. If you look at the ways in which the various, aspects of the tenses are, handled, English tend to handle them in a very easy way. A single verb has at the most 3 different forms: go, gone, and going. That's basically it. And then the rest of the aspects of the tenses are handled by adding modal verbs like I have gone, or I am going, or I shall be going. You add a modal verb to take care of all the complexities of the aspects of the tense. Other languages don't do that. Each form has a verb of its own. It's a very cumbersome approach. English is a very versatile, and also because English as a language has never been afraid of borrowing foreign terms. It has over time acquired a very rich vocabulary. We speak of veranda. That's not an English word. We speak of pundits. That's not an English word. So there's a huge amount of word that has been brought into English, and the English as a language tend to be not particularly worried about purity. Whereas French is the total opposite. They have a language academy whose job is to protect the purity of the language. So all around, and the fact that I happen to have mastery of the language is purely accidental. I went to school only up to grade 5. And after that, I became a monk, studied in the monastery. It so happened, this was in the early 70s, the monastery that I was a member of was in Dharamsala. It was at the height of hippie movement. There were quite a lot of hippies around Dharamsala. And because the monastery had a very unchallenging curriculum, mainly involved memorizing liturgical texts, once I've done it, which takes about an hour, I have the whole day open. So I started hanging out and somehow picked up the language. And by the time the monastery moved down to South India, I had a reasonably good basis to keep going. So it's probably, as a Tibetan, I would probably say I have some kind of karma with English. And then, of course, when the opportunity came to serve His Holiness, initially as an accident, clearly the karma did manifest, and I've been able to serve him. And if I had not been able to speak English, I wouldn't be able to serve him in that capacity. So for me, English has been a powerful tool, but also a tremendous source of opportunity to serve the Dharma and serve His Holiness. So this is my kind of love of English, And so I began writing in English, and one of the things that have bothered me for a long time is someone who has so much affection for my own Tibetan intellectual tradition, history. There was very little in the form of narrative literature, like biographies and so on, which actually is written in a human way. The only thing that is inspiring to read is the Milarepa's life, because Milarepa's life story is a real human struggle story where you see someone who is going through a tough time, coming out of it, and be showing resilience and seeking enlightenment and finding a true freedom. That's pretty much it. And I deeply admire Tsongkhapa, but when I read his, standard official biography, they're more like hagiographies, Right from the beginning, he's turned into, manifestation of Manjushri. So, and as an ordinary monk, ordinary person, you can't really relate. If someone is already a Manjushri at the time of the birth, you just can't, you have to put them so far away. And I was kind of hoping that why can't we have a real human story, a biography of lamas that tell the story? So that has kind of bothered me. But then, of course, you forget and you do some other things. And then every now and then this thing pops up. And then I knew that in 2019, a big anniversary was coming, 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's nirvana. And I was thinking, maybe I could do a biography. But then I started looking at the resources that were available. I read all of them, and I wasn't convinced there was enough, even though some of the biographies are in 300-400 pages long. But there was a lot of hagiographical kind of component that there was, other than some chronology, there wasn't enough to work on. As I was thinking about it, I came across, actually what happened was I sent a list of 4 biographical texts of Tsongkhapa that are no longer extant. But I found a list of a monastery in Amdo, which seems to suggest that they may have copies of it. So I asked a friend of mine whose uncle is a monk in that monastery to see if he could check. And this monk checked, and I don't think he was told who was asking the question. Probably it could be complicated. So he didn't need to be compromised. And the monk took photographs and sent photo images. And when I looked at the photo images, they were modern reprints. They were in a Tibetan, modern book format. I said, this is a reprint. So clearly, it is now in a book format. So I said, can the monk take a photograph of the title page and the colophon page? And when I received this, it was printed in Lhasa. And it turns out it was part of a 4-volume collection of all of the biographical writings on Tsongkhapa, except for one which has been reprinted before. So I got excited because in that volume contained one very, very precious text, which is a collection of notes taken by 2 of Tsongkhapa's attendants over a period of 21 sessions. So these were pretty much kind of verbatim notes taken. And I know its existence because there were references to it in many of the biographical texts. But I've never seen the text themselves. And although because I've seen the references, I asked my own teacher, Je Tsongkhapa, if he had seen one. And he said he had never seen one. He knew it, and they were, in the past they were. And I've asked other senior lamas, and nobody seemed to have seen this. So when this particular text turned up, I got really excited. So I had someone managed to get me the entire 4-volume set from Tibet within actually 2 weeks. It was pretty fast. So probably by that time, this person may have told why this guy is trying to get hold of this. And I delved into it, and there was enough resources. And then on top of that, I also was able to obtain a PDF copy of the biography of Tsongkhapa's most important teacher, Rendawa, and written by Rendawa's own attendant, who knew Tsongkhapa personally. So there was a lot of references to Tsongkhapa. And then around that time, Rendawa's own collected works also turned up, because many of his collected works were lost. And he, among all the great Tibetan teachers of the time, was the most influential person on Tsongkhapa's thought. Rendawa was a Sakyapa, Tsongkhapa wasn't, but Rendawa was his main teacher. So to find Rendawa's collected works really also gave me a lot of inspiration. And then also there were other important figures of that time, one of which is the author of the Blue Annals, Goyolotsawa Shunupel, who was quite junior, but he was also a student of Tsongkhapa. And Goyolotsawa has 2 biographies. One of them was written by the third Shamarpa, who was a student of Goyolotsawa. And in those writings, there was a lot of reference to Tsongkhapa. And then once I had these texts, then I knew I had enough material to work from. So I thought, okay, I could do this. And I was doing it partly for selfish reason, which is, I'm a father of 2 girls. They're now 20 and 22. And, at this point, they have great admiration and pride in their Tibetan heritage. They identify themselves as Tibetan and Buddhist. But to what extent they're doing this because His Holiness is present? Or to what extent they're doing it because they have some appreciation based on some understanding? And so I was thinking that if they were to think of Tsongkhapa, if they were to think of what would come to their mind, are there any real substance to the ideas and thoughts and feelings that will pop up if you say, what do you think of Tsongkhapa? Other than saying he founded Ganden, he was the founder of Gelug tradition, what else? And I realized that there wasn't much to go on because they don't read Tibetan and they read in English. Similarly, then I thought, these 2 girls probably represent thousands of young Tibetans who probably don't have much facility with Tibetan, classical Tibetan. And if they're going to read anything about their history and culture, they're probably going to do it in English. But then what is out there? So these things gave me even further motivation. I hope my motivation is not purely selfish for my 2 girls, but that's part of it, that because it brings concreteness to what I was trying to do. So once I made the decision, I was fortunate to be able to spend some time in Dharamsala. So I wanted to do it in an auspicious way. Tibetans, you can call us superstitious, but we take auspiciousness very seriously. It's called tashiba. So everything important that you start has to be started in an auspicious way. There's even a Tibetan saying that if you get the first day wrong, then the entire month goes wrong. So if we're embarking on something important, Tibetans will make really sure that all the conditions are right, all the stars are aligned, and so I wanted to do it in the right way. So my two girls were doing a Tibetan language summer camp. They were coming up only for one day on Saturday, which meant, I was quiet, and my wife was doing a voluntary teaching in Ladakh, which meant I was now really peaceful in this flat alone without having to feel social responsibility to look after someone or be available for someone. So I decided to do a writing retreat. So I chose an auspicious day, began with Lama Tsongkhapa, 100 deities, Kandal Hayama practice, one mala round of Mitsema, Tsongkhapa's name mantra, and then I plunged in. So, okay. And my resolution was I was going to get 3 weeks to get half of the book out, 40,000 words. That was my goal. And I plunged in. Now, those who know what writing feels like, sometimes you have really good days, sometimes you have really horrible days. But for some strange reason, or not strange reason, but I really was almost in a state of a trance. I was able to really get 40,000 words out, 45 in fact. But on the second day, at the evening of the first night, I was feeling a little apprehensive because the subject of my biography is not just another Tibetan. This is a master who has been deeply revered for 600 years, whose embalmed body was encased inside a stupa in Ganden and worshipped for almost 600 years. He is seen by the tradition as a manifestation of Manjushri, fully enlightened. And I myself do a Guru Yoga practice of Tsongkhapa every single day in the morning, which involves seeing him as a completely enlightened being. Am I doing the right thing here? Turning him into an ordinary human being and trying to tell a story? I started to get a little doubt. So I went to bed thinking, I'm not so sure here. Sort of second thoughts emerging. So next morning when I did my meditation, the sun was shining and the atmospheric conditions were perfectly right. I could see this brilliant rainbow across the mountain. Then I said, okay, I have permission. I don't need to worry. I have the permission, my motivation is pure here. So I began writing, and I was really surprised to see how much came out. I suppose because I was thinking a lot, I was prepared. By the time I had already done the outline, rough outline. So the biography is written really in a way that would tell the human side of Tsongkhapa's story, his struggles, his influences, and also the culture and the historical context in which he operated, and also trying to give some answer to the explanation. Why did this particular master become the most influential teacher in the entire history of Tibetan Buddhism? What made this master very special? And I am a believer not so much in the history of, there are two ways of looking at history. One is the history is made of great people. In the old day it was great men. So the history is the story of great men. The other one is a way of looking at history. It's more of a, important, leaders are important, but it's really the cultural context, the historical forces. I'm more of an in-between. Which meant, to a large extent, the success of Tsongkhapa had to be explained by the cultural historical context in which he happened to be functioning. Now, I was looking for those, and then as I delved deeper, I've also found out that he was very fortunate to be operating in central Tibet during one of the most politically stable time. This was the Phakdu dynasty. The Phakdu dynasty the rule began in 1354. The Phakdus toppled the previous Tibetan government, which was Sakya rulers who were ruling as proxies for the Mongol Yuan rulers of China. And the Changchuk Gyaltsen, Taiyasudu Changchuk Gyaltsen, toppled the Sakya rule and established the Phakdu rule. And in fact, one of the amazing things the Taiyasudu Changchuk Gyaltsen did was to really bring back the imperial Tibetan character of the Tibetan rule, dress codes and everything he changed. And he also established a remarkable ruling system where the actual rulers were always celibate monastics. And his thinking behind this was that if you have a family man, then there is a conflict of loyalty. And also when the family man has many children, the children compete for the succession, which then creates a whole sorts of dissension among the ruling elite. And he has seen that happen in the case of the Sakya rulers. So as Changchuk Gyaltsen began a Tibetan ruling system where the rulers were always celibates, and the rulers' brothers' children, some of them would go to monastery, and they have to go through the whole philosophical training, and they will be groomed as future rulers. And initially, he in fact also made the heads of all the principalities monastics, and he made them rotate. So he really was a very visionary person. And early on, Tsongkhapa had a very close relationship with one of the Phakdu rulers. And the longest ruling Phakdu king was Trungpa Gyaltsen, whose reign began in 1385 and lasted 1440 something. So no, at 1430 something. So he reigned for 47 years. So throughout the period when Tsongkhapa was really active as a great master and teacher, it was this ruler. There was a tremendous political stability. And also the fact that Phakdu rulers established a very close connection with Tsongkhapa meant that the Phakdus were the main benefactors of Tsongkhapa's activity. So you can see, the conditions, happen to be perfect for someone like Tsongkhapa to come into the picture. Tsongkhapa was born in northeastern part of Tibet, Amdo, and the region where he was born is called Tsongkha. That's where he got his name. Tsongkhapa literally means the man from the onion land. Tsongkha is a land of onions, and Tsongkhapa is, refers to his birthplace. He was a son of a merchant, quite a important merchant of a very ancient clan, one of the six, 5 brothers and 1 sister. According to the biographies, there was a local Lama who was a mystic by the name of Je. He had a prophetic dream, the night before Tsongkhapa was born. So to cut a long story short, the day after Tsongkhapa was born, there was an attendant of Chagyung monastery of this Lama who brought some gifts for the parents, and with a letter of instruction saying that this is a special child, take good care of him, be clean. So soon after, the Lama himself met with the parents and said that, at some point I would like you to give the custody of your child to me. Imagine, I don't think I would be able to let go of my kid. So at age 3, Karmapa happened to pass through on his way back from China, Karmapa Rebbe Doji, and Tsongkhapa had his ceremonial hair cut by the Karmapa and given the name Kunga. And at age 6, the Thupten took custody of the boy and brought him to this beautiful monastery on an amazing ridge that overlooks the Yellow River, snaking down to this vast valley. The boy grew up, spent 10 years on this amazing kind of rich monastery on this mountaintop. he was educated for 10 years, did all the memorizations, received many initiations, did many of the early kind of training there. And I think the fact that he spends 10 years of his early childhood on top of a mountain with this amazing vista below really had a huge impact on him. Later in his life, most of the time, he was in one hermitage or another. He was very rarely in the main monastery. And the way I found that out was looking at his correspondence. If you look at the correspondence at the colophon, it often tells you where he wrote this. And most of those letters were written from one hermitage or another. So Tsongkhapa lived his entire life with his love of altitude, huge vista, and solitude. So I think probably that early childhood experience left a huge impression on him. He's said to have, the Chögyö Trungpa Rinpoche early on introduced Manjushri to be his main meditation deity and made him recite the Om Arapasanadi mantra. Every Tibetan child is supposed to do it. I don't know whether these days kids do it. So early morning you get up, you say Om Arapasanadi. So there's a prayer that precedes it. And then it's supposed to be also good for your tongue. So tongue twisting, because some of the pronunciations. So when I was growing up, we did it. My kids don't do it. The excuse is they're not living in the Tibetan community. But so Om Arapasanadi mantra, Om Arapasanadi. Tsongkhapa, by the time he was 16, ready to leave, he had repeated it over 100 million times. So he had already been doing a lot of retreats. There was apparently a special meditation hut built for Tsongkhapa at Chagyong Monastery. Today it's known as the Arapasa hut. This is where he was doing all this mantra. But the Trungpa Rinpoche remembered very clearly that when Karmapa blessed the young boy, Karmapa told this master, when he grows up, send him to central Tibet to study. So the Chögyö never forgot that advice, even though he was very close, he was very attached. And for all intent and purposes, he was the father figure, he was the parent figure. And there was one period when Tsongkhapa was very sick as a child. Apparently Chögyö really nursed him. So there was a very close affection bond between the two. But when he turned 16, Chögyö said, you need to go to central Tibet. So he made all the preparations, gave him a beautiful instruction. Some of the instructions are still in verse because Tsongkhapa remembered them later and told his students, they wrote them down, but not the entire advice. And the advice is pretty systematic, tells which text to study first and all the progressive kind of approach to scholarship and all the rest. So one fine morning, Tsongkhapa descended the mountain and left with a caravan to go to central Tibet. And it's around 2,000 kilometers trek from Amdo all the way to central Tibet. There are two main routes. One is the northern route, one is the southern route. They went through the southern route, through Kham, and up to central Tibet. The first landing in central Tibet, about a year later, almost a year later, a couple of, 9 or 10 months long journey, because they're walking with yaks, landed in Drigung Monastery, Drigung Til. Drigung is a Kagyu monastery. And that initial landing at a Kagyu monastery instead of a Kadam or Sakya monastery had an important implication. Because of this, throughout his life, Tsongkhapa's relationship with Kagyu tradition remained very, very strong. And Drigung actually, for a while, became his contact address. You remember in the early days in Dharamsala, when the hippies were running around, they used to have address, which is the post box. You give the post box address of a town and you go and pick them up, So Drigung Monastery was the post box office for Tsongkhapa. So when Tsongkhapa's mother or parents, I think his father died quite early, but his mother and siblings would send gifts to him. They would all ship it to Drigung Monastery by care of Drigung Monastery. So that's how initial connection was established. Of course, Tsongkhapa remembered that he was supposed to study, so he began his study quite earnestly. And in Tibet in those days, there were 4 major disciplines. One was professional wisdom studies. It's closest to what we could today call religious studies. And then there was pramana, which is epistemology and logic. And then one is abhidharma, which is equivalent of psychology and metaphysics. And then finally there was vinaya, which is ethics and monastic, vows. Madhyamaka wasn't a part of the formal discipline at Tsongkhapa's student years in students. There were 4 main disciplines. Tsongkhapa had already began studying Parchin when he was in Amdo. So, and there was a tradition for what is called to do the debate rounds, Tagore. So when a student has done a study and completed, then the student has to go from one monastery to another monastery and formally sit down for a debate in that particular monastery. And it's called Tagore. Tagore, Ta refers here to debating courtyard, and Kora means to go around, go on the round of debating courtyards. Tsongkhapa did his first when he arrived in Tibet when he was 17. He had his first Tagore in 19. He continued to study, and by age 23, he had completed his studies and did all the Tagores, and he was known as the Kashipa, the master of 4 disciplines. So, and since then he was known as Kashipa Lobsang Drakpa. Lobsang Drakpa was his real name. He took full ordination when he was 23, and around 24, after he had done all of his studies, he started teaching informally. But then one thing that was very important influence on his early life, young years, was he spent 4 years in a reading retreat at Tselkhungnam Monastery. This is a monastery quite close to Lhasa, and this is a monastery. The specialty, uniqueness of this monastery was this monastery housed the first entire collection of the Tibetan canon, Kanyu and Tengyur, which had been edited by Putin just 30-40 years earlier. And this is a special library that has all of those texts in one place. When Tsongkhapa had a chance to be there, that was it. 4 years of intensive reading retreat. We don't have much information on what kind of timetable he had. It's probably a combination of a lot of silent sitting practice versus reading and writing notes. Towards the end of this 4-year reading period, he began writing his first major philosophical work called The Golden Rosary. It's a commentary on a major Indian text. He began and he finished it when he was 31. So it took him about 3 years writing this. It's a 2-volume text. To this day, it stands as one of the greatest academic writing ever done in the Tibetan language. We like to think many of the sophisticated techniques, that methodology that we use in modern Western scholarship, literature review, situating the topic in the context, cross comparison, critical analysis. We like to think these are modern Western kind of, scholarly apparatus. You find all of them there. Amazing. Tsongkhapa particularly had a way of dealing with the topic by presenting in such a way that if he would choose, say, for example, like the concept of dependent origination, he would have the first part, he will have something called Chidun, general presentation. So he would give you this big picture. What is this all about? The big picture, the terrain. And then something called Tachu. So then there's an analytical part. And then finally, a concluding section. So in Chidun, when the Parchin, the Serteng, the Golden Rosary, when it came out, immediately established his reputation as a great scholar. There was just the admiration for Golden Rosary was near universal. And in the early days, because at that time the block printing culture hasn't started, the block printing culture actually began towards the end of Tsongkhapa's life. And Tsongkhapa himself was instrumental in introducing the block print, wood block print in Tibet and disseminating that culture. So in the early days, there were official scribes whose job is to copy these texts. And imagine multiple copies they were producing, but the Golden Rosary, the setting to this day, hasn't been preceded by any text which is a commentary on this very important Indian text, Abhisamalamkara. And in Golden Rosary, what happened, which also created a bit of a stir, because in this work, Tsongkhapa was not quoting the authority of any Tibetan masters. He was going back to the Indian sources, and he was engaging with the Indian roots directly. And that caused both admiration, because it is a thoroughly independent approach, but also annoyance is probably too weak a word. Some, animosity or anger on the part of some, thinking that here is an arrogant brat, who is dismissing the contribution of all the great Tibetan commentators who went before him, and he's acting as if the terrain is brand new, that he's walking on this path alone. So it generated a lot of heated discussion, but the admiration was near universal. From that point onwards, Tsongkhapa's focus was completely, almost entirely Indian. Kangyur and Tengyur. He was on a mission to really make sense, because the Tibetan tradition has inherited this entire very diverse Indian tradition, which includes the very profound philosophical teachings of Nagarjuna, as well as Buddha nature and Tathagata Garbha theory of Maitreya and Asanga, with the mind-only philosophy of Asanga and Vasubandhu, the epistemological and logical traditions of Dharmakirti and Dignag, as well as the Abhidharma, complex metaphysics and meditation theory of Yogacara, and on top of that, huge Vajrayana, tantric literature. Tibetans inherited everything. And in sometimes, the integration isn't that quite, the matching doesn't really work. If you're going to make a sense of this very diverse material and try to create a kind of a cohesive understanding. That was Tsongkhapa's mission. That was his focus now, to make sense of the diversity of all of this, which would require developing a hermeneutic principle. If you're going to interpret, you need to have a theory of interpretation. And that theory of interpretation needs to be grounded in some hermeneutic principles and some basic philosophical standpoint. You have to prioritize among the complicated Indian sources, which one is a more fundamental perspective, which one is more of an epistemological approach, which one is more from an experiential cognitive perspective. All of this needed to be worked out. And in all of this, where do you put the Tantra? Tantra is a very different kettle of fish. Even the language is different, even the feeling is different. And there's all this imagery. For example, in the sutra text, non-Tantra text, attitude towards the afflictions like attachment and so on, is actually fairly judgmental. They're bad, they're supposed to be written off, detachment, all of this. You go to Tantra, the attitude is completely different. There's nothing wrong with these. These are natural. In fact, in order to become enlightened, you need to tap into the energy of these emotions. It's like, how do you make sense of these two contradictory perspectives? Yes, you do need to make sense of these contradictory perspectives. So what Tsongkhapa was doing after that, coming out of that 4-year retreat of reading, was to really take all the Tibetan interpretations, connect it back to the Indian sources, and reinterpret and come up with a fresh reading of this very complex Indian heritage. Another thing that Tsongkhapa did, which also sort of annoyed quite a few, was he wrote an open letter called Letters Addressed to the Meditators of Tibet. The subtitle is queries from a sincere heart. So he knew it was going to offend people. So queries from a sincere heart, an open letter to the meditators of Tibet. That was the title of this short, and it's written in a very conversational style. It's not written as a treatise. It was written in a very conversational style, and with a youthful exuberance, and the language is beautiful. And many of the questions that we now hear, if you're an academic, been paying some attention to this whole mindfulness movement, you know now there is a growing critical voice asking what exactly is going on here, what is the construct, what is being measured, what are you talking about when you say mindfulness? These questions are all there. Tsongkhapa talks about, and the text is structured in terms of view, meditation, and action, which is an important tripartite Tibetan framework. So view is the understanding the nature of reality. Path is the practices that are sort of meditation is the actual sort of incorporation of that into your mind, and then action is how you behave coming out of that. So this is a very important Tibetan framework, Tawa Gompa Chöpa, Tagum Chösum. So the letter is structured as a series of rhetorical questions on the view, on the meditation, and on the action. And so on the meditation, the series of questions that he asks are in fact very relevant today to people who are talking about mindfulness. He is asking what exactly is the construct here. So when you say mindfulness, are you talking about mindfulness or an object? And when you say you are paying attention, or when you say mindfulness, are you talking about the subjective quality of the mind itself, where it is restful, where it is not distracted, or whether you're talking about a quality of a mind in relation to an object where you are focusing on something and you are not losing that attention? And when you say meta-awareness, what exactly is meta-awareness? Is it a separate aspect of the same mind? Does it involve a double dimension awareness of the, splitting the mind into two levels? Are we talking about a higher order cognitive processes? He asked all of these questions. And on the view, of course, he asked questions about, emptiness. And he, at the end, he says that, I'm aware, some of these questions may offend some, but he says that all of these questions are coming from a sincere heart, because he says, I feel not getting these concepts right, there's a lot at stake. And if your entire life is dedicated on meditation, and if the object of your meditation and the content of your meditation is not correct, imagine what kind of habits you are cultivating. And he's right. So, and so this was another text that sort of brought him into the consciousness of a lot of Tibetans at the time. Later, historian Pawo Tsukla Tengwa, who's a great Kagyu master and a historian, when he came across this letter, he gave a kind of a historical context to this. He says that the reason why Tsongkhapa wrote that letter in such exuberant kind of, tone was because he just came out of spending a couple of months with a group of retreatants in a hermitage, and he was very saddened by seeing the level of lack of understanding of Dharma on the part of many meditators. They were very, very devoted practitioners, but their understanding of Dharma was quite limited. And he felt deeply concerned. So he was asking these rhetorical questions, not as a critique, but as a way of raising self-critical understanding of what you are practicing. So those two are very important seminal moments in his early life, his student years. Of course, the biggest influence was Rendawa. Another important factor that really made big difference in Tsongkhapa's life was meeting with a mystic by the name of Umapa. Umapa was not a scholar, he was a meditator, but one unusual quality Umapa had was occasional visitations of Manjushri. And it turns out Umapa had this experience from a childhood. He was a shepherd, and one day he fainted, and when he woke up, he realized that he had this capacity. So his visions of Manjushri was tested by other lamas. And then one of the things that Umapa did was he came to central Tibet, probably at the urging of Manjushri, and was told that he needed to meet Tsongkhapa. And particularly he needed to receive Saraswati empowerment from Tsongkhapa, because by that time Tsongkhapa was believed to have some visions of this goddess of wisdom and poetry, Saraswati, because Tsongkhapa started writing beautiful poetry. So to cut a long story short, his meeting with Umapa really changed. Umapa became the medium for Tsongkhapa's communication with Manjushri. Now that, I have a whole chapter on this, and that was a tough chapter to write, because I'm writing my modern biography keeping in mind the skeptical Western reader. How do I present this phenomenon? The fact that Tsongkhapa had encounters and communications with Manjushri seemed to be fairly universally accepted. There were references to this in Rendava's writings, Tsongkhapa's own teacher. Tsongkhapa's own communication with Umapa refers to this. And then other Tibetan scholars around the time also talks about this phenomenon, this uniqueness of Tsongkhapa. So whatever the actual nature of that experience is, there was a phenomenon. So that's how I present it to the reader. It's up to the reader to judge what that phenomenon is. But one thing that cannot be denied is there is a phenomenon here. And that phenomenon involved some kind of ability to communicate with Manjushri. So Tsongkhapa had an on and off several meetings with Umapa over a period of a year and a half before Umapa goes back to Lhasa. There's a beautiful last kind of meeting of the two. They meet up in Lhasa. In those days, Lhasa was also referred to as Potala. This is one thing I haven't quite resolved, because the current Potala was built in the 17th century. So there was still something called Potala in Lhasa at the time. I wasn't quite sure what it referred to. So they met up in Lhasa. They both did retreats. They had their own separate cells, but they would have their meals together. Of course, being serious Buddhist monks, unlike me when I was a monk, they were not eating dinner. A lot of us Tibetans, we tend to eat dinner, but many senior serious lamas, my teacher never ate dinner. His Holiness doesn't eat dinner. But most 99% of Tibetan monks will eat dinner, which makes some of the Theravadan colleagues quite nervous. They say, I don't think you guys are serious. And they probably have a point. But my excuse has always been, in that altitude, if you don't eat, you're going to starve. So they would meet up for meals, but then they would do their meditation separately. And then during the meals, they would have a lot of sharing of experiences. And just before Umapa returned to central Tibet, eastern Tibet, they had a special teaching session on top of the Lhasa Cathedral. Those who have been to Lhasa Chogang, it's an impressive building. So on the top, there are gilded roofs. Under the gilded roofs, you can find shaded areas. So in the eastern part of the gilded roof, under the roof, they set up an altar, just the two of them. And Umapa took an important initiation from Tsongkhapa, and then Tsongkhapa received a teaching from Umapa as a medium. And those teachings are, I have translated some of them in my biography, so I'm not going to read them out because I want you to buy the book. Not because, I want the money, but which is not a bad thing, but because the experience of engaging with these things, particularly when they're presented in the context, really has a power. And when I saw that, I was so happy because it gives you a visual image of these two monks, who have this serious, the heaviness of the awareness that they're going to be parting each other's company. And probably he will never see Umapa again, and they're doing this final teaching session. So over time, Tsongkhapa began to have a direct, visions of Manjushri, and one of Tsongkhapa's own disciple, Thubten Jinpa, who is in fact a year senior than Tsongkhapa, he also had, visions of Manjushri. So one of the most important things that came out of Umapa's serving as a medium for Tsongkhapa was the advice that Tsongkhapa needed to drop everything and go to retreat as a hermit. And in fact, Umapa, serving as a medium, also gave the list of 8 students among Tsongkhapa's many students that he needed to take with him. And they are known as the 8 students of perfect karma, or pure karma. So because of this, and then Umapa started getting really worried, and Umapa, complained to Manjushri saying, I'll be blamed because Tsongkhapa is a famous teacher now. He's got so many students. If he is to drop everything, what is going to happen to his teaching career? What is going to happen to all the students that he is teaching? Manjushri said, leave that worry to me. And Tsongkhapa did leave and he chose to go to this beautiful area in southeastern Tibet called the Wolka Valley. It's a really beautiful area. I've never been there myself. I'm saying as if I've been there, but one of the saddest part of writing this biography was I wish I had the ability to go and visit these places. But these days, with the Google Earth, with all the maps that are out there, and also one of the things that I found amazing was a traveler by the name of Victor Chen. He's Hong Kong, Chinese Canadian. He, in the early 80s, spent 5 years on and off traveling across Tibet on a bike, and he wrote a book, a pilgrimage book to Tibet. That book was brilliant. That gave me the distance, the direction, the architecture, the period. And so when I was able to triangulate that book with a beautiful map of Tibet that I was able to find, and then sporadic images that you can find on Google Earth, and then images that I asked various Tibetan travelers to give me, and I was able to give because in order to write, you need to have a kind of a 3-dimensional sense of the space. And the Wolka Valley is in the southeastern Tibet. Tsongkhapa has to walk from central Tibet and take a boat. It's a small boat. They're more like a dinghy. In English, do you call it dinghy? The Americans call it dinghy. It's a small, in Tibetan we call them kodu, which are really made from yak leather. So he and his attendants or the colleagues took the boat. Then at one point they have to get off and then they walk. And I was able to imagine what it must have felt like when they are getting out of this narrow valley with the river, and as the valley opens up, the vista and the flatness with the stark contrast with the amazing mountain on the back. And in fact, there is a beautiful description of one of these in one of Tsongkhapa's letters. Anyway, I'll read a bit later. So initially, Tsongkhapa used a Kaiku hermitage called Thubten Jinpa because of his connection with Densa Hills. And then later, some of his devotees built a special retreat for him called Yogi. But one thing that is really interesting about Tsongkhapa is that he never stays for too long in one place. He always says that if you stay too long in one place, you get attached. And he's probably right. I've been in Montreal for 20 years. I know what attachment feels like. So he was constantly moving. So even in this hermitage life, he was moving from one hermitage to another hermitage. So he was in 4 or 5 different places. There is Thubten Jinpa, Yogi, Karpuk, which is another place where Gampopa has meditated, and then Jingji Champaling, which is attached to a Jingji Maitreya temple. So he kind of rotated. And although the Tsongkhapa's own biography doesn't say much about initial stages, but Thubten Jinpa, who was one of his senior attendants among the 8, his biography turned up. And his biography has a lot more details. So when they first began, Tsongkhapa was very strict that at the initial stage of the retreat, no Vajrayana. Nobody was allowed to bring any Vajrayana text. They were going to do the basic Ngondro preliminary practice and foundational practices like bodhicitta and renunciation and accumulation of merits and purification of negative karma. The only exception given was to Thubten Jinpa, who had just received the Sakya Lamdre cycle of teachings. And because he is known to have special connection with Manjushri, he had a Manjushri painting. So he was allowed to bring only those one text and that. Everybody else, they were not allowed to bring any Vajrayana text. And so it was a real Kadampa foundational approach. Tsongkhapa wanted to build up from the foundation, from purification practices, accumulation of merit, mandala offering, and in World Cup, it's now a famous pilgrimage place. You can see where Tsongkhapa has done all of his thousands of prostrations. There are smooth surfaces where his head and hands rubbed on a floor or on the rock that he was prostrating on. There is in fact a mandala offering, which is again a rock base. He has wiped it with so many times. It's shining like a mirror. So you can see the repetitive gesture that he must have involved in doing this. So Thubten Jinpa also takes us through quite detailed, but he spent 3 years. Now, the main focus in the end was really bodhicitta, grounded in universal compassion. The bodhicitta is the altruistic aspiration to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings, rooted in great compassion, sort of dispassionate, universal compassion, and the view of emptiness. So those were the 2 main focuses. He was doing his daily sadhanas after a point, but the focus was really on these 2. And then shamatha practice. He made, of course, tremendous strides of progress in all of these areas. Part of that also involved a deeply devotional part of his retreat, which involved restoring this Maitreya statue, writing a beautiful poem, hymn to Maitreya. But when he came out of the 3-year retreat, he came out completely changed man. And I think all of his other attendants did too, because imagine, in fact, initially, for the first few months, they did not eat any hot meal. They were all eating cereals and dry food and drinking water and tea. At some point, it was beginning to affect Tsongkhapa's health. So Tsongkhapa's students requested him to eat real food. And so most of his other students also joined, except for Thubten Jinpa. He was a great mystic. He continued to, lived on cereals and cold meal. So when the problem was, towards the end, his reputation and this group of 9 monks, the 8 attendants and students and him, wandering around, hanging out in this remote area, spread, and more and more devotees were coming to make offerings. Of course, then it defeats the purpose, So when they finished 3 years, then they ended the hermit period. They have all made great progress, but one area where Tsongkhapa felt dissatisfied or unsatisfied was on his view of emptiness. He was still struggling. Now, for us Gelugpas, especially when I was a monk, reading that was actually kind of slightly confusing, because I studied Madhyamaka for a couple of years. I was teaching Madhyamaka, and I thought, I get it. Now here is Tsongkhapa, who has not only excelled in all of his studies, spent 3 years of intensive retreat, and still he's not satisfied with his understanding of Madhyamaka, that means I was missing something here. What is it that I'm missing? So what it turns out was it's not so much the understanding of the text themselves, but what it means emotionally. Because the radical implications of emptiness is pretty scary. Because we human beings, and this is one of the fundamental insights of Buddhism, the source of suffering is grasping. And grasping is what promotes attachment. And attachment leads to all sorts of stuff. But on the other hand, tendency to grasp is so deeply rooted in us. That's one of the reasons why earthquake feels so destabilizing. Have you ever experienced earthquake? Because what it does is it shatters the fundamental assumption that we make that the earth that we're walking on is firm. Next time, see if you can be in an earthquake place. Not a big one. That experience is really deeply, deeply destabilizing. Because you're so used to expecting when you take the next step and place it down, that the earth being there firmly, waiting to receive your foot. When the earth itself shakes, thank goodness they don't last very long. But it is a very destabilizing experience. Now, to truly embrace emptiness, to incorporate into your experience and worldview, needs to have that kind of shattering effect. But I never had that. Despite many years of debating on emptiness and meditating on it, and Tsongkhapa was really looking not just for that, but also the resolution coming out of it. Because it's not enough simply to be shaken up. You need to reset it. You need to, in a sense, up until you realize emptiness, your entire worldview is built on an assumption of permanence and objective existence of things out there. Once you take the rug out of that view, you need to find a way to reframe your perspective on the world, including your existence, that doesn't require that kind of grounding in something firm and objective. And this is where dependent origination plays such an important role, because what you're doing is you're reframing your understanding of the world, the perception of the world in purely relational terms, without needing there to be two things relating to each other like a billiard balls. That's why Tsongkhapa was struggling. And the breakthrough came 2 years after his retreat. About 2 years later, he came back to Wolka Valley for another year of intense practice. And so this time he was just doing completely emptiness meditation. And Manjushri had told him 3 things you need to combine: purification practice, deeply delving into the major Indian classics on Madhyamaka by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, and then constant relating your understanding to your own meditative practice. If you combine these 3, Manjushri said, you will find the view. So that's what Tsongkhapa was doing since he came back. That was his main focus. This time he was doing it alone, not in the group of 8 other. There were other students around, but he was doing it alone. According to the biography, one night, he had a dream, a prophetic dream, in which there were 5 great Indian masters, including Nagarjuna, who were in conversations with each other. And at one point, someone who said he's Buddhapalita, who's a great commentator on Nagarjuna, stood up and placed a text on Tsongkhapa's head. And he woke up from the dream. So that really sort of gave him a sort of a very curious experience. And next day, Now, one version of the story says a monk came and gave him a gift of the same text, Buddha Palita. For whatever reason, next day, Tsongkhapa read Buddha Palita's text quite carefully. And when he was reading the 18th chapter, the chapter on self and phenomena, that's when he had the eureka moment. So it's the breakthrough. I have a whole chapter on this. And I try to describe what it must have felt like. Now, of course, I was kind of guessing, hopefully with some basis. And that experience has to be a kind of a joyful relief. Because up until that point, he is trying to reconcile the objectivity of the world that you perceive and experience and the reality which is emptiness. How do you put, what's the English expression, square peg in a round hole? Square peg in a round hole. How do you reconcile the two? And the reconciliation really has to come from a radical reframing of your perception of the world and a radical emotional adjustment to this view so that you don't have this habitual urge to seek grounding, habitual urge to seek solidity, habitual urge to grasp. And that experience has to be a liberating one. That experience needs to have a joyful quality to it. One thing that we do know is that in the immediate aftermath of that experience, Tsongkhapa's first task was to write this beautiful eulogy to the Buddha for teaching emptiness and Tibetan origination. So that text is available. My own translation is on the website, freely downloadable. And it is really beautiful. I don't know whether I should read some text translations here because I'll end up taking up time. So I'm not going to read, but it's written in, those who read Tibetan, it's written in, first of all, in beautiful poetry. There's an exuberance, there's a joyful energy, and is the primary emotional tone of that poem is that of gratitude. So finally saying, finally now I can appreciate what you have done, kind of thing. And it says that the highest praise for the Buddha is to praise by thanking him for teaching Tibetan origination. So what Tsongkhapa does now is to really bring dependent origination and emptiness into a very close integration. Not two things being combined, but basically one thing seen from two sides. It's like two sides of the same coin. From one, the ultimate reality of nature of reality, seen from a conventional perspective of our lived experience, is dependent origination. The ultimate nature of phenomena, seen from the perspective of seeing its truth, is emptiness. And that, equation, I call it's basically an equation. Emptiness equals to dependent origination equals to emptiness. And that equation is really at the heart of Tsongkhapa's discovery of the meaning of Buddha's teaching. So hence this amazing energy of gratitude to the Buddha. After that, Tsongkhapa then began writing. So his first major text was Lamrim Chemo. I don't know, I've been speaking for a while. Do we still people have enough patience to go on a little bit? Okay, because we can have a Q&A a bit later. So the first major work that he wrote was Lamrim Chemo, which is a great synthesis of the entirety of the Mahayana teachings. And in fact, he wrote it in a retreat setting in Rading Monastery. And in fact, one of the people who requested for the composition of that text was a very senior scholar of Tibet at the time called Lojeng Gyabcho Peltsang, who was in fact about 10 years older than Tsongkhapa. So around that time, there were three most famous, most important masters in Tibet. They were known as the three great masters of Tibet, Central Tibet: Lojeng Gyabcho Peltsang, Rendawa, which is Tsongkhapa's teacher, and Tsongkhapa. So they were they were very close to each other. So it was Lojeng who requested Tsongkhapa, a very senior figure, to write this synthesis. Soon after, once the Lamrim Chemo, the synthesis, became widely available, again, Lojeng himself and a couple of other senior Lamas asked Tsongkhapa to write a similar synthesis on Tantra. So Lamrim Chemo and Ngarim Chemo are really two great syntheses. So the Lamrim Chemo is almost equivalent to those who are familiar with Theravada, Visuddhimagga, the path of purification. Buddha Gosha's path of purification distills the entirety of the Theravada teachings and presented as a practically applicable series of practices and understanding. Lamrim Chemo is exactly that. It's the stages of the path to enlightenment. And Ngarim Chemo is the stages of the path of Tantra. So once these two syntheses were written, Tsongkhapa started gathering huge amount of students. Now they have a kind of a rallying point. They have a master, but then they have these two, compendiums. And he started gathering a lot of students. But even then, Tsongkhapa never stayed long in one place. He kept moving around. And later, when he moved around, he was being followed by a couple of hundred monks at a time. So it was proving very cumbersome. And it was proving a lot of strain on the local, donors who were hosting Tsongkhapa, because when you host Tsongkhapa, you also have to feed all of these hundreds of monks who are wandering with him, So if you look at Tsongkhapa's life, it's really reminiscent of what the Buddha was doing. Buddha never stayed at one place for too long. He was moving from one place to, the longest he would stay is the rainy season retreat in one particular place, but then he would move on. And Tsongkhapa was exactly doing this. And basically, Tsongkhapa and all of his monastic followers were just walking, huge amount of walking. So in my book, because walking across this is such a, impressive idea for us in the 21st century, I made sure that there was a map in the book that showed where Tsongkhapa was active, so that you can see the distance that he had to walk around. So, well, of course, by that time, he was also taking Vajrayana practice very seriously. So I haven't focused much on Vajrayana here. You can read in the biography, you can read in the book. One of the things that he focused on was initially obtaining all the transmissions. And his main emphasis was on receiving the transmissions that are coming from Marpa Lotsawa, especially on Guhya Samaja and Chakra Samvara, from Phuten and the Chonang tradition on Kala Chakra, and from Goku Palatse on Guhya Samaja. So he was really looking at the Indian sources, but coming through Tibetan translations. And so he became a custodian of all the major lineages. He did huge amount of retreats. He even visited Tsari Mountain, which is a major pilgrimage for Chakra Samvara, Tantra. And towards later, for example, 1409, he established, he instituted the Lhasa prayer festival. And the primary aim of that was to help the Tibetan tradition to redirect their primary focus on the central figure of Buddha and to emphasize the Indian tradition. So Molam Chemo, the great prayer festival, is primarily celebrated to honor the Buddha's miracle performance. So, and then Tsongkhapa himself created the liturgy for these prayer festival, selected from the Indian sources, but his own hymns to the Buddha was very important. So he was instrumental in bringing an important focus on the Buddha and the Indian tradition, because the Tibetans were very committed and loyal to their own individual lineages. So that was an important focus. The instituting the Great Prayer Festival was a major administrative achievement. Actually, if you look at the catalog, they created a separate catalog was what was done and what was offered to the monastics and the important sponsors for each of the day. You can see it was the who and who of Tibet at the time. The lamas, the influential politicians, the leaders. And there were about 10,000 monks who had gathered. and there were thousands of beggars who came together. Lhasa was actually, at night, the butter lamps would lit up the skies as if it was daylight. It was a visually powerful experience. The same year, Tsongkhapa established Ganden. But around that time, he also began writing more formally on Vajrayana. And when he began seriously writing on Vajrayana, his colophon started to change, and he would refer to himself as Yogi of Guha Samaja, Pe Sawandibe Nenjoba, and Yogi of Chakrasamvara. So there is a beautiful translation of one of his major texts on Tantra by Gavin Kilty, A Lamp to Illuminate the Five Stages. Tsongkhapa also wrote quite important text on Vajrayana. I'm not going to go into this, but one very important insight Tsongkhapa brought in relation to Tantra is the deeper understanding of what is the central goal of Tantric practice, which is the cultivating the union of bliss and emptiness. So there are two things that are being put into pair, bliss and emptiness. And Tsongkhapa's understanding was that when it comes to emptiness, there is no real difference between Tantra and Sutra. There is no deeper emptiness that needs to be discovered in Tantra. Because if that is the case, then Nagarjuna's philosophy of emptiness would not be the final view of reality. So emptiness is the same, but what differentiates is the subjective mind, the mind that is realizing emptiness. Now the difference is, in the sutra, it is really the mind, the intellect, the conscious thought that is realizing emptiness. Now in Tantra, that mind has to be an innate blissful mind. And that, in some sense, there is a very strong emotional dimension to the subjective quality of the experience of emptiness in Tantra, and where the tone of that experience has to be bliss. And this bliss ultimately is sexual in nature, because it involves the dissolution of the ego consciousness and experience of union. So those are powerful, it's complicated ideas, but I'm just giving a teaser here. I have 2 full chapters on Tantra, one on Guhya Samaja, one on Chakrasamvara. And one of the very important ideas in Vajrayana, the highest yoga Tantra, is the concept of clear light. The clear light is the fundamental, essential nature of mind, which is pure and which takes on the coloring of whatever advantageous states of mind there is. When you get angry, it takes on the color of the anger. When you get attached, it takes on the color of anger and so on. But by itself, it is luminous. It's the pure luminosity. And for ordinary people, that experience of pure luminosity comes to the fore only when we die, at the moment of death. But that is kind of useless for us because we have no ability to utilize it. So the yogis, one of the central objectives for the yogi is to cultivate in their conscious meditative states similitudes of that clear light state of mind, which involves withdrawing the thought processes so that you progressively get to the subtle levels of consciousness. So you move beyond the senses, you move beyond the concepts, you move beyond the constructs, you move beyond language, you move beyond thought, you move beyond ego consciousness to a point where it is very, very subtle. And that subtlety of consciousness can only arise when you're also able to bring the energy, the wind, to that level too. So at a fundamental level, matter and mind, matter and consciousness are inseparable. The energy is the medium, consciousness is the activity, is the perception. And so there's a powerful idea, and that's why we have the deity yoga practice, where you are progressively working on your identity. You're playing with your identity. You are loosening up your ordinary identity. So there was so the Vajrayana practice is profoundly, powerful but that power has to come from progressively getting to the finer and finer and subtle states of consciousness while retaining your awareness. Because when we die, we black out. We can't use that pure mind at the point of death. And the idea for the yogi is that because of their training, that's one of the reasons why in the sadhana, daily practice, we simulate death experience. Because we are trying to simulate that experience of dissolution. So for a yogi, when the final moment of the point of death comes, the yogi can still maintain the awareness and bring understanding of emptiness right at that moment. And this is called the meeting of mother and son clear light. The son clear light is the cultivated one, and the mother clear light is the natural one that arises when gross levels of consciousness ceases. So those are powerful ideas, and you can get a sense that, if you have the time, if you have the understanding, and if you have the dedication, it's doable. I mean, that's the thing, that's the sense you get from reading Tsongkhapa's writings. He is taking us through this very deep process in a very methodical manner. And that is the beauty of Tsongkhapa's writing. So many of Tsongkhapa's works are now available in English. On the philosophical side, I've translated quite a few. On the Vajrayana side, Gavin Kilty has done a good job of the, and there are still some text that needs to be translated. There's one text which is really important. His Holiness occasionally asked, when are you going to translate that? It's a 5 stages in a single sitting. It's a Naropa, based on a Naropa instruction. It's a beautiful text. There's another text on completion stage of Chakrasamvara according to Luipa. If you read Tibetan and if you look at that text, you feel like dropping everything and going to the mountains. So I think that's the power of Tsongkhapa's writing. And so by the time Tsongkhapa passed away in 1419, he had left a powerful legacy. And his followers came to be referred to as Gandhenpas. Ganden was the monastery that he established. And so huge amount of monks congregated to Ganden. And they were known as the followers of Ganden Monastery, Gandhenpas, or also Gedenpas. So Ganden had an alternative name, Geden or Ganden. And Gelug means the followers of the Geden Monastery or Ganden Monastery. So the Gandhenpas became, and of course by that time Tsongkhapa had attracted very prominent students who would be hugely influential in their own right. Gyaltsab Je, who was his successor, Khedruk Je, who was the next successor. Both of them were Sakyapas. Both of them came from Tsang province. First Dalai Lama, who built Tashilumbu Monastery. Golotsawa, who was the author of the Blue Annals, who remained Kagyupa, but was a student of Tsongkhapa. There were many other important figures. For example, they remained Sakya themselves, but was students of Tsongkhapa. Jamyang Kache, who wrote a beautiful eulogy to Tsongkhapa on the 5th week after Tsongkhapa's death. He missed his teacher so much, he wrote a poem, and it's called 80 Tsongkhapas because there are many repetitions of O Tsongkhapa, O Tsongkhapa, O Tsongkhapa. In Tibetan, it's called Tsongkha Gechu. And the remarkable thing about that poem is that it actually lists all the things that were believed to be true about Tsongkhapa at the time. Many of the mythologies, the prophecies, and so on. There were a very important Kagyu master who was the person who requested Tsongkhapa to compose the 6 yogas of Naropa instruction text. Jenga Sonam Gyaltsen, he remained Kagyupa. So there were a lot of these students who were, great, and many of the abbots of the different monasteries around Lhasa, they were all students of Tsongkhapa. So by the time he passed away, he had left. I don't know whether he actually consciously thought of starting a new tradition. I'm not quite sure. But I think he was aware that his was a new approach. So let me put it that way. But whatever may be the reason, when he left, passed away, 1419, these days with the computer, there's a whole calculation system on internet that if you type in the Tibetan date, it throws out the equivalent Roman calendar. So I was able to calculate the exact Roman calendar. So according to Roman calendar, actually the 600th anniversary falls in November 11th. So it's already gone. But because we are doing according to Tibetan calendar, this year it falls on the 21st of December. That's when we're going to have a big celebration in Ganden. So after Tsongkhapa passed away, soon the Gandenpas got together and then start seriously thinking about how to consolidate the legacy of their master. So they made the decision to entomb his body inside a stupa, built a special temple for it. Kirubje was assigned to write the official biography. So Tsongkhapa's first biography was written less than a decade after he passed away. His collected works were compiled fairly early, and then his students went to different parts of Tibet. So by the middle of 15th century, Tsongkhapa's tradition had really spread far and wide, and that is the Gelug tradition. And Tsongkhapa collected works, I have 18 or 19 volumes, depending on which editions you have. So, and to this day, regardless of whether you see yourself as a member of the Gelug school, universally in the Tibetan tradition, the recognition of Tsongkhapa's contribution to the reinterpretation of Buddha Dharma coming from India is widely celebrated, recognized, and appreciated and admired. So, and in fact, universally in Tibet, Tsongkhapa really came to be known as Manjushri, Jamyang, and iconographically, he's depicted with the Manjushri symbol. There's a, where is Tsongkhapa's image here? Here, so there's a sword on his right and the scripture on his left, which is Manjushri's symbol. And he's often in a teaching gesture, a gesture of Dharma. So that essentially is the story of Tsongkhapa. In this book, I try to write it in such a way that this book, by using Tsongkhapa's own life and the chronology as an anchor, that this book could also serve as a really good introduction to Tibetan Buddhism and a little bit of history as well, and particularly the intellectual, philosophical tradition. And because in the Tibetan tradition, all 4 schools, major schools, 5, if you include Chonang as a separate tradition, talk of the Tibetan tradition being union of Sutra and Tantra. What does that mean? So I try to answer that question in the book so that you can truly appreciate that the Tibetan tradition is a union of Sutra and Tantra. And when His Holiness says that the Tibetan Buddhism is a complete form of Buddhism, what does it mean? It has all the elements of the Theravada teachings, foundational path. It has all the elements of the Mahayana teachings, 6 perfections and emptiness and bodhicitta. It also has all the elements of the Vajrayana teaching, all integrated as a comprehensive, coherent path. So I tried to write the book in that way, and thank you for indulging me, for allowing me to speak for so long. And I've just turned 60, and I feel truly privileged to be able to write this. Among all the things that I've done, a couple of things I feel deeply grateful. One is the opportunity to serve His Holiness for so long. The other one is to serve the Dharma through translations and so on. And the third one is having this opportunity to write this biography. There's a beautiful verse at the end of Tsongkhapa's 7-point mind training, where he says that now, even if I die, I have no regret. So, so to an extent, not exact completely, but I kind of feel it. I'm getting there. Thank you. I thought I would read from some of the passages, but I think I'm going to leave it to you to read it yourself. So maybe we can have some question and answers. And it doesn't have to be connected to what I said. So, yes?
Tell us when the essence of eloquence was written.
Essence of Eloquence. Yes, this was, yes. This is actually one of the most influential among all of Tsongkhapa's writing. Probably, so the question is, when was Essence of Eloquence written? This is Tangye, the hermeneutic text. This was soon after Lamrim Chemo was written. This was before his commentary on Nagarjuna's text. So it's in between. So after this big Lamrim Chemo synthesis was done, he wrote this sort of self-standing monograph on hermeneutics. Essentially, it's a philosophical text using hermeneutics as a method to present in a very coherent and systematic way the ultimate view of reality according to Chittamatra, the mind-only school, and the Madhyamaka school. This was written, I think he was probably around age 43, 44. And at the end of that, let me read one actually. At the end of that text, there's a beautiful poem. So if I can find it, okay, so let's see. Oh yeah, actually, so I found it. Okay, so this is, he has written this beautiful philosophical text, which runs into about just over 100 long folios. It's probably about 200 pages in English, or maybe 200, just over 200 pages. And he's just finished, writing this. So he writes it at the end. He says, one moment you swell with joy or faith in the Buddhas. The next, you remember the kindness of the charioteers. He's talking about himself, the experience of writing this. At others, reverence for the wise spiritual teacher and heartfelt compassion for the suffering beings, and the wish for the precious teaching to long endure. These feelings rise up as if competing with each other. At this time, you realize that such is the magic of the path of reason, so hard to find, yet longed for so long. He's talking about his own struggle with the emptiness. Shouting, oh yes, and how wonderful. Even when you are alone, joyful exclamations come forth. Moon-like speech would honor such a person, repeatedly with garlands of praise like the following. Meditator of the highest wisdom, leader of those pure and ethical discipline, Buddha heir who has discovered the definitive meaning, the intelligent who wish to win such honors from the Buddha the intelligent who wish to win such honors from the Buddha should immerse themselves in this clear exposition and purify the eyes of their intellect through the path of philosophical reasoning. By whatever merit I may have gained through this effort in differentiating the two systems of the charioteers, he's talking about Asanga and Nagarjuna, may I uphold all the sublime teachings of the Buddha, just as Nagarjuna and Asanga did. So this is, I memorized, when I was a monk, I memorized this entire text. And of course, the topic is very dense, but the writing itself is beautiful. And that sometimes makes me conflicted when I see English translations of a text that I'm deeply familiar, and then you don't see the music and the poetry in the translation, and then you start thinking, So, sometimes I feel conflicted. And I'll say the same thing with my own translation. Something gets lost in translation. Hopefully not the meaning. Yes?
My question is regarding more about how one relates things about Jamyang ministry. I've always found it easy to consider ministry a way that's a way for humans to understand the energy of wisdom.
Yeah.
Because I've looked for it when there was a historical character, and I can't find any sources that suggest that. So can you help me with how I relate and consider Jamyang?
Thank you. That's a really good question. In fact, that is the status of figures like Manjushri in the Tibetan Buddhism is an ambivalent one, actually. And in some cases, sense it's a deliberate. Because Manjushri figure has multiple dimensions. In the Mahayana literature, Manjushri is seen as a historical figure, a bodhisattva who was in a celestial form during the time of the Buddha, present at many of the teachings of the Mahayana scriptures. So that's the Mahayana historical perspective. So historically in the sort of a broad sense. Then you have Manjushri in the Vajrayana, where Manjushri is really seen as, in some sense, representation of the enlightened wisdom of all the Buddhas. So then it's not so much an individual being, but more of a kind of an archetype. But then you also have in the Vajrayana Manjushri as a meditation deity, in which case it's a little different from this archetype, but now as a deity, meditation deity, where yogis experience visions of Manjushri, and you make personal emotional connection and engage in the practice of cultivation. So in my book, actually, I sort of talk about these different aspects. So depending on which particular context you are, if you're reading Mahayana scriptures, then it's probably better to relate to Manjushri as a figure, a person who may be in the celestial form, but it's a bodhisattva. But if you are doing Manjushri sadhana, like Om Arabhajanati and so on, then it's probably better to view Manjushri as a meditation deity, whose vision has been experienced by different yogis, who then, based on those vision, have written these sadhanas that could be used by future practitioners. And this way they establish an emotional connection. So I think it depends on the context. It's very difficult to say Manjushri is this. And the same thing goes for Tara, same thing goes for Avalokiteshvara. It's a complex, and it's a deliberately ambivalent status, and it has to be contextualized. So sometimes when people translate books and they say in the glossary, Bodhisattva of compassion, I say, well, which context you're talking about? Because if in the Vajrayana, then it's a Buddha of compassion. So, but if you're talking in the Mahayana context, then it's a Bodhisattva of compassion. So you can't say, this is where the Western approach sometimes falls down. Western approach needs to be, because there is this idea that truth is only one. So it's either he's enlightened or he's not, Yes.
I got to meet the Lelung Rinpoche yesterday, and he said to say hi.
Who is this? Lelung Rinpoche. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. There's one here. Listen, yeah. Please do not feel shy. You don't need to ask questions related to what I said. So,
I've got a very mundane question. When you were working on this book, were you surprised by anything? Was there anything that was really unexpected or shifted your view?
There were a few surprises. One was the extent to which Tsongkhapa was walking around so much. Because, growing up as a Gelug monk, we put Tsongkhapa so elevated, and then we see the only point of reference is we have high lamas, who don't walk, who are, in old Tibet, they were taken on horses, decorated by special, things. But for me to find how much he walked, that was a real revelation. And for me, in fact, my admiration for him deepened, because it spoke volumes about his dedication and humility. The other thing was, I noticed how really skillful he was politically. That was also a bit of a surprise, because he received 2 formal invitations from the Yongle Emperor, who's the emperor of Ming Dynasty, China, powerful emperor. He found a way to wiggle out of it. And the second time he sent Chamchen Chöje, the founder of Sera Monastery, as his representative. But both times, and there's, in fact, we have a record of one of Tsongkhapa's response to the Yongle Emperor survives in the collected writings, and one of Yongle Emperor's letter inviting Tsongkhapa survives. But they don't match because it was two different periods. And one thing I noticed is the Tibetan biographers have confused. They've assumed one letter each was responding to each other. That was not true, because it turns out there were two different, because the Yongle's letter was dated as 11th year of Yongle rule, and you can count it, And Tsongkhapa's letter was dated according to the Rabjung cycle, so we know the exact dates. So that really showed a kind of a certain sophistication of political thing. And another thing is, if you look at the amount of people, influential people who sponsored the Molam Chemo, the first day is the most important, 8th day is the most important, 15th day is the most important, and then there were 15 days of sponsoring. They were pretty much all the who's and who's of Tibet of the time. And if you look at Tsongkhapa's correspondence, and many of the correspondent recipients were those people. They were merchants, they were leaders, they were abbots. So, but on the other hand, Tsongkhapa was also very smart and never formally signing up to any position. Although he was very close to the Pagdu ruler, he kept the relationship personal and informal. He never took on any title. And in fact, he very rarely visited the palace. He had the ruler come to him and sponsor different teachings. And and then in fact, in one of his there is a beautiful prayer at the end of one of his a praise to one of his teachers, the Lama Umapa. And at the end of this, he's in his late 30s, early 40s. And some of the aspirational prayers that he has at the end are really powerful. He says, "May I be never tempted by power. May I be never tempted by position. May I be never tempted by fame." Beautiful. I think he was absolutely self-critical and aware. So those things surprised me a little bit, actually. Yeah. And also, to what extent his struggle for getting to the bottom of emptiness was so real and so long. That surprised me. Because, when I finished my Geshe, I was kind of satisfied with my level of understanding. So I was that was quite a surprise. The other thing was, I was kind of a little surprised how, and looking back, it's probably not a surprise, how Tibetan biographers did not bring out the importance of the historical political context of Tsongkhapa's activity, the important relationship between Pagdu rulers. They do talk about it, but they never give you the full picture. And also the dynamic relationship between some of the senior Kagyu Lamas and him. He was much closer to the Kagyu, and he was very familiar with the Mahamudra and 6 Yogas of Naropa, two very important instructions of the Kagyu tradition. And it's no coincidence he wrote an instruction on the 6 Yogas of Naropa. And, he was practicing Mahamudra for a long time. So those, you don't see much in. And another thing that was a little surprising was that there was very little contact with the Nyingma tradition. Yeah, and probably because there was no influential functioning monasteries in central Tibet around that time. And also, Tsongkhapa was primarily interested in going back to the Indian sources, so he was probably less interested in the Tibetan indigenous tradition. And also, maybe what was happening was there was a cross-denominational conversation going on between the Kagyubas and Kadambas and Sakyapas, where the great scholars were interacting in dialogues, conversations, and teachings, and no senior Nyingma figure seemed to have participated in that. That is probably the reason. But Tsongkhapa was exposed to the Nyingma views because in his collected writing there is a instruction that he receives from another mystic, Lodrak, Thubten Jinpa, who has a vision of Vajrapani. And Lodrak Thubten Jinpa request for an instruction for Tsongkhapa on behalf of Tsongkhapa, and he sends that instruction to Tsongkhapa with a letter, and Tsongkhapa writes back acknowledging the receipt of that, and this instruction is called Gelug, medicinal a garland of medicinal nectar, and the view that is presented in it opens up with a very Dzogchen sounding terminology of purity of katak, and the energy being compassion and the spontaneity, that sort of three attributes of Rigpa. The word Rigpa is not used, Wesel is used instead. So Tsongkhapa was aware, but and the later biographies kind of note this, but I was kind of a little surprised that for someone who has been so exposed to the multiplicity of sources, that there was a real paucity of his interaction with the Nyingma tradition. Yeah.
Hello. So regarding the Nankar Gyaltsen, he advised him not to go to India.
Yes.
Because Tsongkhapa wanted to go to India.
Yes.
I kind of struggle with this because he already was very kind of realized master. Yeah, he wanted to go to India where all the monasteries were destroyed. Why do you think this happened? What was the kind of...
Well, this is one of the saddest part of when I was working on the biography. When I read those kind of things, I felt very sad because it showed the level of ignorance on the part of Tibetan understanding of the history of India. So by that time, the movement of translators going to India has ceased. So the latest was Chaglo Tsawa in the 12th century, late 12th century, or early 13th century. And Chaglo Tsawa's own biography talks about at Nalanda there being barely around 70 monks, and talks about when he was with his teacher Rahula, Chaglo Tsawa talks about the monks being always afraid of raids coming from these Central Asian Turkic Muslims destroying the monastery, and every now and then, it's a bit like when you're in war, you have these sirens coming, so they will be, announcements and monks would run away. And there's this tragic story of how one day everybody left and he was left alone with this Rahula, who's a very senior monk, elderly monk. And Rahula told Chaglo Tsawa, you should go too, because you are not from here. Why do you want to die in a foreign land, defending this old monk? So after that, there was very little interaction between Tibetans and India. But in Tibet, there was no understanding that the Buddhism in India has pretty much come to an end. So Nankar Gyaltsen was also not aware of this. Tsongkhapa, of course, wasn't aware. And Nankar Gyaltsen talks about the fact that if you go to India, you will get great honors, you will become the abbot of Bodh Gaya monastery. But probably Bodh Gaya was no longer functioning then. So, I don't really know, but I think, looking back, Nankar Gyaltsen was right. That Tsongkhapa shouldn't have gone. If he had gone, he would have been tragically disappointed. Thank you. Yes?
Out of all of Tsongkhapa's writings on emptiness, is there any one in particular you feel is most helpful to deepen one's understanding of his thought and view?
I think the starting place probably is his beautiful poem on dependent origination. There are a number of commentaries. Two particularly stand out for me. One is by the second Dalai Lama, where he not only comments on it, but also he adds additional verses to flesh it out. So that's a beautiful commentary. And then there's another one by Changyā Rinpoche Dorje. So, and the advantage of that is it really gets to the heart and to the tension of how do you balance the picture that is coming from the dependent origination side and the picture that emerges through the emptiness side, and how do you balance the two and how do you equate. And so why is the equation important? All of this is much more explicit in the poem. But the poem is in verse, so it's, you don't have much there, but you need to sort of flesh it out. So that is really a good place to start. And then after that is probably, there is the first 25 to 30 pages of Tsongkhapa's commentary on Nagarjuna's text, Zashetikchen, commentary on the Mula Matimanga Karika. It's called Ocean of Reasoning, Rikpe Jaso. There is a general account of the whole context and why emptiness, and what is at stake here. It's about 30 to 40 pages long, and he says that this should be applied to all the other chapters. So that, I think, is a really good place. And then finally, you need to grapple with, of course, Nagarjuna's 15th chapter and 18th chapter, Tsongkhapa's commentary on them, and then his commentary on the 6th chapter of Chandrakirtis, which is hopefully coming out next year. So, and it's my translation, so I may be biased, but as much as possible, I try to make the English stand on its own. That's an important task of the translator. The translator cannot translate in a way where the understanding requires going back to the Tibetan. Then it lost its purpose. The whole purpose of translation is for the translation to speak by itself, stand on its own. We may use some props like explanatory footnotes or good intro, or but the English translation has to stand on its own. So the 6th chapter of Gompa Rapsel, it's really powerful. But you need to combine, and in my introduction, I actually suggest which aspects to combine, because they are in different parts. And if you're a serious student, that's a good book. Yeah. Yes.
Tashidele. My question is a little out of context, out of this Tsongkhapa. Although there is no commandment from Buddha for all the Buddhists, like a central point is all about dependent origination and emptiness. There's a little misunderstanding in all the Buddhist community about the vegetarianism. Could you please explain on this? Is there any direct teaching from Buddha that what to do on this vegetarianism? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question, actually. There is a growing movement within the Tibetan community, especially among the youth, to really kind of promote vegetarianism. And in this context, sometimes those who don't like being pushed around then raise this question, where does the Buddha say that vegetarianism, Buddhists should be vegetarian? Now, in the Theravada text, Theravada is not the right word to use, but in non-Mahayana texts, such as Theravada and other non-Mahayana texts, scriptures, there is no explicit prohibition of non-vegetarian meal. There is, however, a very explicit statement on making sure that you don't order in the non-vegetarian meal, because if you order it, then the animal will be killed because of your need. And the reason for that is because the monks are supposed to live on alms. So when you walk around, whatever is dropped into your begging bowl, you're supposed to eat. So that is the reason why in the non-Mahayana scriptures, there is no explicit prohibition of eating non-vegetarian food. So in some sense, it's a practical. And part of that may also have to do with kind of, Buddha was a bit of a rebel, and he was revolting against certain strictures of his time. And in the Brahminical tradition, there was a strong stricture against non-vegetarian food, not out of compassion, but because it is impure. So it's this, obsession with purity was something that the Buddha did not really, appreciate it. So probably part of the reason why in the non-Buddhist sources there was no strong prohibition also reflected that kind of practical kind of attitude. Now, in the Mahayana sutras, there are sutras. If you look at Lankavatara Sutra, there are many sutras which actually Shantideva brings them together in his Shiksha Samuchaya, compendium of training. He actually puts them together. And in those, some of these Mahayana sutras, actually when you read them, for someone who's not a vegetarian, it's pretty disturbing actually. And Shantideva, in fact, citing one of these, says that if you are truly Mahayana Buddhist, you just can't eat meat. He says it's as simple as that. He says, you just can't. He says, how can you? So in the Mahayana scriptures, there is. So in Tibetans being Mahayana Buddhists, I think those scriptures should be persuasive. And historically in Tibet, because the monastic tradition, primary rules of the monastic traditions come from Vinaya. Vinaya comes from non-Mahayana sources, so the vegetarianism was not strictly emphasized. And also for practical reason, if in Tibet, if you don't eat meat, what are you going to eat? Nothing grows up there. Now in India and other places, it's much easier. So that's, I think it is a debate that goes on, and now there's even more powerful environmental argument to promote less eating meat. It turns out that if we are able to reduce intake of beef by half, that has a measurable environmental impact. So those are really very powerful arguments. Tuchana, thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much on behalf of Mongolians, and very nice to see you again. Lama Tsongkhapa's writing is amazing in terms of, in many ways, but one of them is referencing, and his referencing is just like modern scientists now time. It's amazing. And also his Holiness says modern time religion is actually science. So my question is, what do you think how close scientists we are to understand and experience the union of bliss and emptiness, eventually enlightenment, so that it can be explainable? And what do you think, what tools are needed to speed it up?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. But the interesting thing about science is that with science, if you can't measure, you really can't do anything. So that's part of the challenge. That's part of the strength of science, because they are able to measure, they're able to quantify, they're able to calculate, they're able to predict. So it's also very powerful, but there is also part of its limitation, because without measuring, you can't really do much science. So I tend to believe, among philosophers, when it comes to the nature of consciousness, there are optimists who believe that science will finally explain it, and there are pessimists who think that it will never happen. And then there's in between a place people called mysteriists. I'm more of a mysterist when it comes to the nature of consciousness, and if nature of consciousness itself can never be fully captured by science, then there is no way that they can find a way to capture clear light. And the bliss and emptiness, the bliss side has to really come from the quality of the clear light mind. So I don't think, I think where the dialogue between science and Buddhism become very powerful is on the broader level of worldview, understanding the law of impermanence, the importance of causality as an explanatory principle. Just like science and Buddhism, you don't need to invoke divinity to explain for the origination of the universe. Just like science and Buddhism, we also use observation as an important part of our exploration and all of this. But at some level, I'm speaking for myself, I feel there has to be a parting of company, because Buddhism's agenda is lot more broad and ambitious than science. So I think we can go very far, but it'll be up to a point. So that's my feeling. So I like to call myself a mysterious. I occasionally go to these conferences where they have a science of consciousness. There's a whole, this is a new field. Occasionally I go and I present the Buddhist perspective, particularly Tignaga and Dharmakirti. And then when the debate comes, I say I'm more of a mysterious. Yeah. Anila, when we need to stop, please let us know. Okay.
I have a slightly more theoretical or philosophical question, and this relates to my own research as an academic in international politics. And the question specifically, is related to the agency benefits of realizing and practicing emptiness or / dependent origination, right? So in Western psychiatry, sociology, and international politics, there is the theory called ontological security, which is basically the pursuit of a sense of self which is stable, holistic, and continuous. And the reason why individuals and actors like states pursue this is that it gives agency, the ability to do things to achieve national interest or personal objectives. So from a Buddhist point of view, we say that while individuals have a sense of self or an experiential self or phenomenal self or whatever we want to call them, there isn't a metaphysical or ultimate self. Right? So my question is are there theoretical or philosophical treatments of the agency benefits of practicing, realizing and practicing dependent origination?
Well,
that is my first question. So if you could speak in reference to particular texts or scholars, particularly Tsongkhapa, Nagarjuna, and other Buddhist masters, it would help me in my current research.
Well, thank you. That's a very complicated question. Clearly, one of the main reasons why Buddhists take emptiness very seriously is the implications it has. And in fact, to truly realize emptiness is nothing short of, truly experiencing liberation and freedom. And the reason for that is because a large part of our problem and suffering comes from too much grasping, an assumption of an objective independent existence, and including one's own self. And the more we are able to see the relational character of everything, including our own self, the less gripping or less grasping we will experience, which will allow more flexibility. And to an extent, I think we also see that now in cognitive science. For example, in therapists, people begin to realize that if the patients are able to develop more cognitive flexibility, then they are less tense and they are less stressed. For example, one of the powerful things that have come out of mindfulness teaching or dissemination is the ability to teach people who have depressive tendency and rumination to really teach them to say, okay, these are just thoughts. These are thoughts, and thoughts are not necessarily real. So recognizing thoughts as thoughts, which is part of the Buddhist practice in the mindfulness training, seems to offer some room and flexibility so that they don't have to immediately chase after it and be dragged by the energy of the thought, rumination. So those are, they are very crude, but they are similar kind of indicators. But the radical implication or the radical message of the absence of ontologically real self, I think that is a tough one. I don't know if it can be really brought across these kind of disciplines which require a fair bit of certain constant constructs. In order to start talking about some things, you need some constants, or what the scientists would call invariables. Before you're talking about variables, you need to find some invariables or constants, which then becomes the point of reference from which you can make sense and come up with theories. So in those kind of situations, I'm not quite sure the radical aspects of the emptiness theory could be actually applied. In quantum physics, maybe, but in political theory, in all of these, I'm not so sure. It's just because it's just so fundamentally radical. It's suggesting that you need to make peace with the total groundlessness of reality. That's a tough one. So anyway, thank you for the question. On that note, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. Oh, okay.
Janju Senjo Rinpoche Ma Ke Panan Ke Gyuchi Ke Wanyam Pa Me Payang Gong Ne Gong Du Pel Wo Sho Gawi Wa We Ko We Shinkan De Pendan de wa malu junwe ne chenre zi wan tensing gatsoi shape si te badu tengu chi.
Thank you for taking us into the world of Lama Tsongkhapa and bringing him to life and creating a context. Oh, it's okay. I don't know. And building up the world in which he lived, and also, most especially, giving us a taste of his passion. And you were talking about dropping everything to go into the mountains, and I think you really awakened. I'll only speak for myself, but I know for others, you really awakened that seed in us and wanting to pursue what he did with some semblance of that enthusiasm and passion. So thank you so much. I've just got a few more announcements, if I may. October here coming up is a phenomenal month at Jamyang. I used to be at a center called the Vajrapani Institute, but I was there for 15 years, so I just it's a habit. But on Wednesday night, so we have a wonderful new resident teacher called Geshe Namdak, who's Dutch. And on Wednesday in particular, I want to draw attention because Wednesday focuses on emptiness, and that text that you spoke so beautifully about in praise of dependent origination. So if you want to get together and receive, a wonderful commentary, that's every Wednesday night. Next week, we're receiving the visit of Venerable Thupten Jinpa, who's the founder and abbess of Shavasti Abbey in Washington State in the US. And she's leading a talk on Thursday night that we've labeled Dharma in the Future. And she's been working with His Holiness and editing with His Holiness this absolutely unbelievable multi-series, and volume 4 is about to come out. And it's really His Holiness's, presentation of the Buddha Dharma for a Western audience of today. And His Holiness had a very clear vision that he didn't just want it to be the Tibetan Buddhist presentation, but he wanted to bring in presentation of other Buddhist tradition. And it's an amazing series. And she's dedicating years of her life to edit His Holiness's teachings and checking with him and receiving clear guidance from him. So she will talk about that series on Thursday night, how it came about, and what His Holiness's vision is for that presentation of the Buddha Dharma. So I'm really thrilled that she's coming in and doing that. And then on Saturday night, Vicki McKenzie, who's sitting here, who's a author and journalist and longtime Dharma student and friend of Venerable Thupten Jinpa, will interview her. And so we've called it a chat with Venerable Thupten Jinpa. And I think I'm personally very much looking forward to that event as well. There's a few more, as you know, of course, in October, it's 2 weeks of Extension Rebellion activity, and we've put together a program of phenomenal events related to, the bodhisattva activism and the climate crisis. And so Fabiana put together this fantastic flyer that presents all the different events that are happening that month. So please grab one home, and on the other side is, Geshe-la's teachings. But on the 13th of October, on Sunday, Geshe Lakdor, thanks to the support of the Office of Tibet, Geshe Lakdor will come in the evening. And the title is Universal Responsibility and the Climate Crisis. And Geshe Lakdor is a trustee of the Foundation of Universal Responsibility. That's a project of His Holiness. And so join us for that as well. So thank you all. And thank you.